if you indent something and get a patent on it, you have less of an incentive to keep improving because you can charge a monopoly price. It reduces your incentive to keep innovating. And it also reduces the incentive of your competitors to improve on your idea, because if they make an improvement on your original idea, they can't sell that improvement because that would be blocked by your patent. So in other words, as far as we can tell, the patent system reduces the incentive to innovate.
Before we dive in, a quick whisper about today's sponsor, Ghost Founder. You know that moment when an idea jumps from someday to why not today? Ghost Founder lives in that moment. Ghost Founder takes the sketch from your napkin, gives it a heartbeat, and walks it out into the world. Fast. While everyone else is still writing pitch decks, the ghosts are wiring prototypes, lining up seed investors, and tuning your ops. Product market fit isn't just a hope, it's an outcome. If you're the kind of renegade who refuses to wait for permission, visit ghostfounder.com. Because around here, we scope things, build things, and fund things, in that order. Ghost Founder, the quiet engine behind loud breakthroughs. Today, on the covered call, we're joined by Stephan Kinsella, a patent attorney who turned libertarian legal theorist, whose work has challenged one of the most entrenched ideas in modern economics, that ideas themselves can be owned. Stephan is well known for his book Against Intellectual Property and for his decades of writing on the legal foundations of a free society. In this conversation, we hope to explore what true ownership means, how innovation happens without monopoly, and what a legal system built for freedom might actually look like. Stephan, thank you so much for taking the time to connect and talk with us today.
Glad to be here.
Hey, yeah, Stephan, really super excited. I mean, I've seen you couple of times in the last few months in Turkey as well as in Vancouver. Now it's the first time I'm actually seeing you online.
That's
but
right.
Really excited to have you. So let's say somebody looks at our podcast and looks at this episode. They try and want to find out who is Mr. Kinsella, right? And the first thing that comes up is typically libertarian and ANCAP or anarcho-capitalist. Would you say that's fair? And also, could you give our audience just a 1,000-yard view of what those terms mean?
Yes. I started out as a nothing, like in high school, just interested in philosophy, but then I read Ayn Rand and became pretty interested in objectivism, and because of that, a libertarian, although she wouldn't use that term. And about maybe 5 or 7 years later, I finally became an anarchist from reading Rothbard and the other guys. I used to use the term anarcho-capitalist to describe my libertarian views, but I tend not to use the word anarcho-capitalist anymore, although sometimes I can't help it. I prefer the term anarchist libertarian. Anarchist libertarian to distinguish my views from those of left anarchist and left libertarians. And I think that's one reason some ANCAPs use the word ANCAP to say that we're not a typical left anarchist or left libertarian. But I think libertarianism implies anarchy and vice versa, to be honest. So I don't think you could be a libertarian without being an anarchist. And I don't think you could be a proper anarchist without being a libertarian, because the left anarchists are really, they end up not supporting property rights or supporting the state, one way or the other. So I don't think they're true. Now, they would say the same about us. The left anarchists would say that, the socialist anarchists would say that libertarians are not true anarchists because we would support capitalism and hierarchy, which would undercut whatever rights they kind of believe in. But basically, I'm an Austrian economic influenced, Rothbard and Hoppe influenced, and Ayn Rand to a degree influenced libertarian. I'm also an attorney, or I'm a retired attorney now, but I was a patent attorney and an intellectual property attorney for a long time, and had a regular career in law. But on the side, I also had a career or an avocation doing writing, both legal writing for my career, like on international law and intellectual property law and other aspects of legal theory, but also libertarian writing. So for about 30 years, I had written a good deal of libertarian theory articles on rights theory, on punishment theory, causation, contract theory, and intellectual property. And I put all those together in a book about 2 years ago, all my writing on libertarian legal theory. which includes intellectual property, but also the other stuff. So that's sort of who I am. I'm now basically just focusing on libertarian writing and speaking, and working on, just several different writing projects. My next project will be taking all the intellectual property stuff I've done. I started writing on it about 2000, a little bit earlier, but really my systematic stuff started in 2000, 2001. I've written a lot since then, so I'm combining that all into a brand new book on intellectual property, like from scratch. And I'm going to call that book "Copy This Book," and it will be out hopefully in a couple of years. So that'll be like a representation of all of my views under one, between two covers. So if I do it the way I want to do it, you can throw away all the other stuff and just have one book. Because right now, if someone says, what should I read on IP, I have about 25 articles that I would point you to, but it's too scattered. So I'm going to put it all together into one project. So that's my next big project, is a book on IP.
Nice. And the book, Stephan, that you published 2 years ago is the one behind you, right? The Legal Foundations in Free Society. Is that right?
Correct. Legal Foundations of a Free Society. It's articles written over 29 years, but I edited it in a way that I think it reads a lot like a book that was written from scratch, because it's pretty systematically organized and lots of cross references between chapters. There's some redundancy, because you can't help that when you have a book like that. If I took out the fluff and the redundancies, it would probably be, instead of 800 pages, it would probably be about 400 pages. So my next project after my IP book will be to write a libertarian treatise from scratch, which would probably be about 400 pages, is my guess.
Lovis, just hang on. I just want to hone in a little bit on the word anarchist, right? Just because I think most people, that when they hear the word anarchist, like even my close friends and family, the first thing they think about is someone that has a blowtorch, wearing a black hoodie and a mask,
Right.
trying to destroy stuff, right? And maybe they're shouting down with the state, down with power, etc., but they're still
Yes.
destroying stuff. So there's a lot of fear involved with that word. So I've just started reading this book, and I haven't finished yet. It's called The Conscious Resistance: Reflections on Anarchism and Spirituality. I'm not sure if you know that book.
No, haven't heard of that.
But in there, he quotes this guy called Karl Hess, a libertarian activist. You know that guy? So he wrote a book called Anarchism Without Hyphens.
Mm-hmm.
And he describes, I'll just read a quote. It says, "There's only one kind of anarchist, not two, just one. An anarchist, the only kind, as defined by the long tradition and literature of the position itself, is a person in opposition to authority imposed through the hierarchical power of the state. The only expansion of this that seems to me to be reasonable is to say that an anarchist stands in opposition to any imposed authority. An anarchist is a voluntarist." Would you
Yeah,
agree?
I don't quite agree with that that framing. Number one, I don't like the term voluntarist semantically. I think we have a good term. I think libertarian works fine, although some people think the term has been corrupted. I think libertarianism implies anarchy, so I think libertarian still works. I would view minarchists, which are minimal state libertarians, as just inconsistent libertarians. But I think the term is broad enough to encompass them. I wouldn't broaden the term to include classical liberals. I think that they're close cousins, or their predecessors. But so to me, the term libertarian means a principled libertarian who opposes aggression in terms of property rights. So basically, our understanding of aggression is based upon a consistent understanding of property rights, which is basically, we have property rights in our bodies, and we have property rights in scarce resources in the world that we acquire by occupation or homesteading or by contractual transfer. That's basically the core of all the private law and all of what libertarianism entails. Now, there are two types of libertarianism in a sense. There are, and I don't mean minarchism versus anarchism. I mean the libertarianism that is the activist type, that is people who are interested in it for activist reasons, like trying to make change in society, which is fine. But I don't think that's the core of libertarianism. Libertarianism is a political philosophy which has a view about which laws are justified and which laws are not justified. And a law, it would be the institutionalized application of force in society. And so the laws that we believe are justified are those that are the ones that enforce property rights based upon the principles that I mentioned: self-ownership or body ownership, and occupation and ownership of resources by occupation and by a contract. Now, that view doesn't have any implications about what type of system that you prefer or that you recommend, or any system or any way that we can achieve liberty. That's a strategy or a tactic or an activist concern. So quite often you will have someone say something like a minarchist will say, well, the anarchist system of courts and law and arbitration won't work for the following reasons. But the reason they say that is they're thinking like a statist mini central planner. They're thinking like, we have a plan for government, is like the US Constitution or something like that. And the statist has some kind of system of government in mind, or the socialist has a system in mind, or the theocrat. And so the anarchist must have a system in mind, and we just oppose that system. But of course, the anarchist doesn't propose a system. What we say is a moral or an ethical view. We have an ethical view that aggression is unjustified, basically. That is, the violation of property rights defined in terms of self-ownership and occupation and contract is unjustified, and laws that are based upon that are unjustified. So as part of our libertarian view of what laws and rights are just, we naturally see in society there are two sources of rights violations. There are private rights violations, that is, private criminals, people who do not respect your rights. And when they violate your rights, that's a type of aggression, right? So there's private crime. But in society, there's also a bigger source of rights violation, which is the state, institutionalized rights violation. So the state is, that's why you have to have a proper understanding of the state. So the state is not government. The state is an institution that claims a monopoly on defining and enforcing law in society. And that institution necessarily commits aggression, which is why we oppose it. So we simply say we oppose aggression as unjust and as immoral, both private aggression and any kind of institutionalized aggression. And the state necessarily is an aggressor. It's just a public aggressor. So we oppose the state. So that by opposing the state, we simply say that what the state does is unjust. And in particular, by taxing people or by outlawing competition. That's what it means to have a monopoly on the use of force in society. If you outlaw competitors, or if you compel membership in your organization by outlawing competition or by imposing taxes, those are acts of aggression. That's all we say. We don't say that an anarchist society is possible. We don't say how to get there. All we say is that it's unjust. So it's a moral or an ethical position. Now, the term voluntarist, the reason I have a problem with that term is because I just think it's the wrong term to use. We have a term that works already. It's libertarian or anarchist libertarian. Voluntary means an action that is not compelled, or actually it just means a freely chosen action. So the problem with the term voluntarist is that if the right word would be consensual. Like, so if you wanted to have a different word for libertarian, it would be consensualist. Because what we say is that there are property rights in your body and property rights in resources that you justly acquire. And that means that you have a property right in these things or ownership in these things. And ownership means the right to exclude people from using it, which means the right to consent or not to consent. So the essence of aggression or rights violations is non-consensual use of someone else's resource without their permission. So we're against non-consensual use. Now, if someone physically takes my property from me, my owned resource, without my consent, that's an act of aggression. But the reason it's a crime or an act of aggression is because they used my resource without my consent. So if someone, say, threatens to use force against me if I don't comply with their wishes, like they say, if you don't pay taxes, like hand over some of your property, like your money in the form of taxes, then we will put you in prison. Or if you don't fight in our wars, which is what conscription is, we will put you in prison. Or if you smoke marijuana or sell cocaine without our permission, we will put you in prison. By those threats, they are able to get compliance. Just like a robber on the street points a gun at you and says, hand over your wallet. Now, if I hand over the wallet to the guy, or if I hand over my money, or if I comply with the drug law, or I fight in your wars, I'm doing that voluntarily because I've voluntarily performed the action. I do it to avoid the consequence of the threat of force.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if in the law we would distinguish voluntary from involuntary actions. So, if I choose to hit you, right, that's a voluntary action, which could be an act of aggression. But if I have a seizure and my arm involuntarily moves and hits you, I'm not responsible for that because I didn't cause it to happen. Like, that's not actually an action. That's just an involuntary action. So all action, properly speaking, understood in terms of Mises's concept of praxeology, which is humans act by employing scarce means, which are causally efficacious in achieving an end, right? That's what all action is. And the action that employs or uses other people's resources without their consent is aggression, and all action is voluntary. So the question is whether it's compelled by the threat of force. It's not whether it's consensual. So, for example, if a girl gives you a kiss on a date voluntarily or consensually, it's not assault and battery because she consented to it. But if you force her to give you a kiss with the threat of force, it would be rape or assault or something like that. It still might be voluntary on her part. She might volunteer to do it because she wants to avoid being killed or something like that. So that's why I don't like the term voluntary. I know what the spirit of it is. I know what these guys are getting at. But the problem with that term is it's just like people say libertarians are against violence. Well, we're not against violence. Like they'll say we're for a nonviolent society. Well, actually, that's not true. We're against aggressive violence, but we're not against defense. We're not pacifists, right? So we're not against the defensive use of violence. So, for example, I would say that sometimes libertarians say that we're against violence. No, we're against aggression. And they'll say, oh, we're against coercion. That's another misused term. They'll say you shouldn't coerce someone. It's like, well, it's not always wrong to coerce someone, just like it's not always wrong to use force. If you use force defensively, it's justified. If you use force aggressively, it's not justified. By the same token, you could have cases where you can coerce someone into doing something with a threat of force, which is justified. Because sometimes the use of force can be justified. So if someone breaks into my home and I need to subdue them, I might coerce them, just like I might kill them, which is totally justified. It's a self-defense. So it's important to use these terms carefully, just like the term government is not what we oppose. We oppose the state, and we oppose all forms of aggression, private crimes and public crimes, which is committed by an organization called the state. The word government is a vague, ambiguous term, and the problem is that statists of all types, including many statists, which are what I call minarchists, because they believe in a state, people that believe in the state believe that you cannot have law and order without the state, which is why they believe in the state, which is why the state gets away with existing, because it perpetuates the great fiction on everyone. The great fiction is that you need the state to have law and order. And so the statist has the belief that law and order requires the state to exist, which means, but in their mind means government. So government is what I would call the institutions of governance, right? Whatever in society is the institutionalized means of respecting rights. Now, the anarchist, of course, believes that without the state, you can have that, because actually the state is the thing that undermines that. There's no logical reason why people can't respect rights voluntarily without a state compelling them to do so. In fact, the state can't compel them to do so because the state itself commits aggression by its very nature. So these terminological things seem like they're nitpicking, and you don't always have to go there. But sometimes when you get into the nitty-gritty of theory, you sometimes have to clarify. So, for example, I would not say I'm against public school, because what is that? What does public school mean? I mean, I'm against government schools, or to be more precise, I'm against state schools. Right? So state-compelled or state-funded education is what I'm opposed. I'm not against public roads. I'm against government-funded roads and government-monopolized transportation services. I'm not against medical care or health care. I'm against the state monopolizing that function and forcing people to pay for it and outlawing private services. And by the same token, I'm not against law and order. I'm against the state corrupting it by monopolizing it. Are we against government? I'm against the current government because the current government is a monopoly function provided by the state. But it's not government that we oppose. Or any more than we oppose roads, right? We just oppose the state monopolizing these functions.
Is it fair to say that if the state is involved in any of those functions, must therefore deteriorate or be worse than they otherwise could be?
I think so. There are some functions the state does which it may be better at, like propaganda and mass murder and killing, but it's hard to think of anything. So the state does some things that are not inherently evil things, right? Like providing roads and even education is not inherently a bad thing. But by the nature of the state and just by economic reasoning, we can predict that the state will provide even good services in an inferior way. That is, at a higher price and at less efficiency, because they don't face competition and because they can subsidize their services with taxation, which is another thing. The state always is a criminal organization because it either commits aggression by monopolizing its function or by taxing. Either one is sufficient to make it a state. Although in practice, it always does both. So, for example, if the state did not claim a monopoly on its services, but it taxed people, it would still be a state because it could use its taxes to subsidize its provision of defense services and justice services and outcompete private agencies that if it didn't outlaw them, it could still outcompete them. Just like in the United States and in the West, or at least in the United States, there are private schools, but they're only about like 10% of the elementary and high schools because the state subsidizes its public schools, its government schools with tax dollars. And so most people, because of this taxation, number one, the government schools are so-called free. And number two, the people don't have enough money left over after being taxed to afford private tuition. So just by taxing, the government can outcompete private alternatives. So if the government could only tax you, there would be no meaningful private provision of services or justice to compete with the state. And by the same token, even if the state did not tax people, if it only outlawed competition, it could still be a state, because if the state prevents you from going to a private justice agency because it outlaws it, then your only alternative is to go to the state and to pay whatever fee the state forces you to pay. So if the state privatized all the roads right now and says, okay, they're privatized roads and you have to pay a toll every time you use the road, there still wouldn't be really a free market road because the government has either subsidized all the roads with taxes, and so there's no market for private roads for you to go to. So you have to use the government roads, and they could, of course, charge a monopoly price for that. So the point is, when the state has a monopoly on its services or when it subsidizes it with taxes, then it will necessarily not face any meaningful competition, and then it has no incentive to provide an efficient service or at a low price. So yes, I think that the logic of this implies that this is why government services are always inferior to private alternatives.
Yeah, so I two kind of remarks. I'm trying to figure out which one's. The one kind of applies to my current situation. I'm trying to obtain a green card to properly immigrate to the United States. And I'm very much in the situation where, any fee they think of that I need to pay, any document I need to produce, I must, right? There's no alternative. There's no negotiation. There's nothing. Like even a medical screening that involves a very large list of mandated vaccinations, for example, I just have to have administered with no recourse, no nothing.
Right. There's no competition. Yeah. Another example would be, for example, I'm opposed to the patent system, for example, and people say, well, if you don't have a patent system, then you wouldn't have as many pharmaceuticals invented because it takes a lot of money to get a new drug approved. And the counter to that is, well, one reason that it's hard to recoup your costs when you come up with a new drug is that the costs are so high because you have to go through the FDA process. So I might say something like, well, if you just get rid of the FDA, then the cost of coming up with a new drug would fall dramatically. And therefore, you wouldn't need a patent to give someone a monopoly price to sell at to recoup the cost that they wouldn't have had in the first place. And the response to that would be, in a free market, wouldn't you have private certification agencies that you would still have to get your drug approved by some free market certification agency to persuade people to buy it, right? Which I think is true. But the thing is, you can't just say just because there would be a private certification agency, the FDA is a reasonable simulation of that, because it faces no competition. And so there's no reason to expect that the rules that they impose are free market rules. They can just tack on whatever fees they want and whatever requirements they want. And they don't all relate to drug efficacy or safety. Sometimes it's political, and it's the government's doing it in the first place, so it's inefficient. So you never know. In fact, I think you always can assume that the way the government does things is always going to be more costly and less reasonable and less efficient than what the private sector would come up with. And your case is a good example of that. I mean, if I want to get a driver's license, I have to do what the government says. There might be a fee. We're used in the US, we don't have the VAT, we have sales tax. So you have to, when you purchase at a supermarket or a grocery store or a store, you know that whatever the price is, you're going to have to tack on 8% or something like that. And, if you travel to another city, you look at the hotel, it's like $300. You know that it's really going to be $500 because there's taxes. There's all these surtaxes that the government just tax on. When you fly, you have to pay the airline their ticket, but then there's all these little things added on because the government, the FAA and the regulatory agencies just tack these fees on, and you have no choice but to comply.
Yeah. So one other aspect of this, so in your definition, right, with what makes a state, what do you think about private businesses, but they become so massive? And I'm thinking of platform businesses, maybe Amazon or Google or Apple, that have almost monopoly positions. Yeah. And there is a real issue for users where it's if you make a mistake, even if you're unaware, or even it's the first time, you might be completely deplatformed, which might really pull the rug out from your livelihood, right? So it's almost a state-like function then.
Yeah, I'm a little sympathetic to the left libertarians in this regard. I suspect, although you can't know, you can't predict what a free market would look like because the state has corrupted it so much. But I suspect that without the state's regulations and interferences, you would probably have more competition and smaller corporations. I think that a lot of the large corporations we have are large. They have largeness in size because of the existence of the state. So, for example, intellectual property law artificially, and other state regulations as well, make corporations larger in several ways. So, for example, Microsoft and Apple and these companies, they have copyrights, and a lot of them acquire patents, which lets them keep competition at bay, and leads to monopolized or cartelized or oligopolistic industries, because, you might have 2 or 3 smartphone companies like Android and Motorola and a couple like that and Apple, and they sue each other for patent infringement, and then they finally settle, and then they just pass the costs on to the consumers. But small companies can't emerge and come up with a new smartphone because they would be sued into oblivion, because they don't have a massive patent war chest that they can use to countersue Apple. And they don't have the money to pay $10 million in lawyers' fees in the first place. So it leads to that. And a lot of business models emerge. Largeness comes because of a response to regulation. So, for example, larger firms can afford the legal departments and the law firm fees to afford to be able to navigate the regulations and to pay the higher wages imposed by minimum wage laws. So Amazon and companies like that, Walmart, these companies, they don't even oppose minimum wage laws because they're already paying above minimum wage. They actually favor sometimes the government imposing these minimum wage laws because their competitors can't afford to pay that. So it kind of prices them out of the market. So I do think that bigness and largeness is partly a response to the need to have enough heft to have to be able to afford to navigate government regulations. And then the companies that can afford that survive, and the ones that are too small just can't. And so, and second of all, some of them have artificial largeness because of government subsidies or protectionism from patent and copyright. So, I mean, the military industrial complex, Raytheon and General Dynamics and all these companies, they're basically just getting taxpayer dollars, right? That's why they exist. I mean, Boeing, companies like that. So without the government subsidizing them with tax dollars and having that industry, and without patents, I think you could have less hierarchy in that sense. Now, this one thing I disagree with Hess on. You were saying earlier. I don't think libertarians. I as a libertarian, I don't oppose aggression because I'm against hierarchy. And I think that naturally in society you would have hierarchy, you would have laws, you would have natural authority. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's probably essential and a good thing. I think that the thing is we have gotten so used to the government, the state controlling everything with regulations and with legislation that we've come to associate and identify authority and regulation with the state. And the people that are against that, like us libertarians, so now we just sort of reject all authority. And this is why some of them reject capitalism, because they identify capitalism in its current incarnation, which I think Gene Epstein calls capitalism, and some people call monopoly capitalism or corporatism. It's not the same thing as pure capitalism, right? Or whatever would emerge in a free market economy. Now, I do think that in a decentralized free society without a state, you would have organizations, you might call them corporations or something else, but you would have organizations because I think just they're more efficient for the production of certain types of goods and they would have a certain size. And I don't think you could have completely decentralized, atomized production. Maybe in the future, it's hard to predict what would happen with AI and with robots and things like that. But for now, I think that you definitely need private businesses, but they can exist alongside smaller firms and sole proprietorships and people going their own way.
So, Stefan, say we were to just hypothetically take an average industrialized country and we said, hey, we want to move it into that direction of, a libertarian society. Would you say, in my mind, intuitively, I feel like the two quickest ways to get there would be either you go through that minarchist route and you really lower the size of government significantly first before the society is ready to then go and say, hey, we don't need a state, or the state, sorry, gets reduced, not the government. Or you have another system where basically you give people the choice and you say, hey, all services rendered by the government, you have to opt in, or you pay your taxes. In that case, then taxation becomes voluntary. You're almost like joining a big club. And if you don't pay, then you don't get any of these services. And if you do need to use a road, you need to pay a toll or whatever that is, and however that shakes out. Have you thought about this? And could you maybe tell me where I'm wrong or if there's a better way?
So that's more of an activist or a tactical or strategic concern or issue. I mean, the question is, can we ever get to a free society? And what would that look like? And how would we ever get there? And is it even possible? Our core belief is that we have an ethical stance that aggression is unjust. Okay. And as I said, that applies to both public crime or institutionalized crime and also private crime. Now, let's imagine a world without states. Let's imagine a capitalist or a free market libertarian world without states. You probably will always have some degree of crime because people have choice and free will. And even if there's a well-respected system of rights in society, courts, enforcement, self-defense rights, still someone could violate your rights because it's not like a causal law that stops you from doing it, right? God doesn't stop you from doing it. The legal system doesn't stop you from doing it. It just imposes consequences after the fact if you do it. So crime will always exist. So even utopia would have some crime or some aggression, some injustice. Would that be nirvana, perfection? I mean, I think that's as good as you could ever get. So then the question is, can you ever have a stateless society? Now, as for minarchy, no, personally, I'm in favor of any incremental movement towards liberty, any improvement in our situation as humans. I would prefer minarchy to what we have now. I personally think minarchists and classical liberals mock us anarchists for believing in some kind of impossible utopia. But what I think is impossible is minarchy. I think minarchy is not possible and is not stable because once you have democracy and any state at all, it's always going to metastasize. And in fact, we've never had a minarchist state in the world's existence. I mean, libertarians talk about the founding of America as if it was some proto-minarchist paradise. But of course it wasn't. It was a state. The federal government was a centralized coup, and women's rights weren't protected. Blacks' rights weren't protected. The Native Americans' rights weren't protected. There was quasi-theocracy in some ways. I mean, that was not a minarchist, and that was as close as we ever got, as far as I know. I mean, in today's world, you might have Liechtenstein and places like that, but even they're not minarchist paradises. So I don't know why they think minarchy is even possible. The nature of the state, it's a monopolist organization, and if you have a monopoly, you will use it. Just like if you have a central bank printing press, they will inflate the money supply because it's free money for them, and they can print money and spend it on things. It's just impossible. That's why Bitcoin is good, because no one has the ability to inflate it. Because if you give someone the ability to inflate money and print it, they will do so because it's free goods you can purchase with it. So that said, from your question, yeah, if we could do minarchy first, that'd be fine. Or if you could do this opt-in thing, the problem is you have to legalize competition. Like, you can't say you don't have to pay your taxes, but then you don't get health care. And we've monopolized healthcare, so now you're screwed. Or you don't have to pay the fee for the road that we set at $100 per ride. You don't have to do that. Fine, we're not making you do that, but we're not going to allow private roads to emerge.
Right,
So
right.
that's
So you
another
have to
way
allow. Okay, so if
you have
let
to
people
allow
opt out, you
competition.
have to allow. I see.
You have to allow competition. Now, personally, I think the human race is in its infancy. And I think libertarians who are activists are frustrated. They keep trying different ways to achieve liberty in a free society now. And some of them burn out and give up because they've been told by the earlier activists, oh, if you just do this, I mean, I've been hearing this for 40 years. This project will achieve liberty in our lifetimes. I mean, I've been hearing this for 40 years, and people before me were saying that for 20 years before that. And we're not closer to liberty right now, any closer than we were 40 years ago. So all the activist projects we keep trying don't work. Educating people doesn't work because most people are not intellectuals and they're not interested in being that consistent. I think the only way liberty is going to emerge, personally, is some kind of evolution where it naturally emerges. It has enough advantages to emerge. And I think it's possible. I think Bitcoin can be part of that. Maybe a kind of quasi post-scarcity society stirred on by high tech and robots and AI. If they don't kill us, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen with that. So what I envision, if we achieve liberty, say in the next 100 years, that's going to be a society where it's like in England, where you have, or in the UK, you still have the monarchy, which used to be in charge, but now it's just a vestige of what it used to be. But it's still around, like as a museum piece almost, and it doesn't really hurt anyone. It doesn't have any real power, and all the revenues they get are from their own sort of remnant properties that they own. I could see that as people become richer and naturally more libertarian in their outlook, right? As we have a more cosmopolitan world, as we get used to dealing with other cultures, and as it becomes harder and harder for the state to stop the free flow of information because of communications and the internet, and as it becomes harder for the state to control things with its money, if Bitcoin emerges as something that people resort to more and more, then you could see the state. I mean, if the state can't sell its bonds anymore, then they have to live on a budget of just taxing people, right? The U.S. government won't have $6 trillion to spend, only $4 trillion or whatever to spend. So that reduces the amount of wars. And if you can, have a robot in your basement powered by your own nuclear generator with your own AI supercomputer, and doing your own surgery, making your own medicines in a 3D printer, you're kind of evading patent laws and copyright laws and all this stuff. Eventually, people become, this is my hope, right? My sort of utopian, naive dream. People become more and more self-sufficient, and you just don't need the government. You don't need the government schools. You need the government medical care. You don't need even the government transportation system. You can just, use a private road or your flying car or something like that. Eventually, the state sort of withers away by becoming a
Obsolete.
joke.
Yeah.
Obsolete. And the example I've given in some talks is that before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990 or so,
89.
89, 90, that time, everyone thought the battle was between capitalism in the West and socialism, and which one would win, no one would know. All the, Robert Heilbronner and these guys were saying socialism might be better in some ways or whatever. No one believes that anymore, right? Because we had a teaching moment. We had an example of the collapse. People who haven't studied economics, everyone sort of takes for granted you need some free market system, some capitalism, some private entrepreneurship, and centralized planning won't work. Now, they haven't really learned that lesson very well, and the lesson is fading because now people are adding, they keep encumbering the capitalism we have with more and more regulations and socialism. So there's always a back and forth, but they did learn something. They learned that you need a free market engine to give us the goods, even if we regulate it and tax it and that kind of stuff. So I think that over time, you could imagine the human race maturing and just the lessons of civil liberties and free markets and individual rights, free market money might get a hold on the human race, not just from experience. So that's kind of my hope. And in that world, states would be like you said, increasingly obsolete. So that's my hope for liberty in the future. So what that means is how are we going to see a free world? The answer is to wait. And people don't want to hear that. They don't want to wait. They want to do something to achieve it earlier. I'm just afraid there's nothing we can do to make it come about earlier. Educating people doesn't work. Our shows are good for educating people that are interested, but we're always a minority of the population. So, I mean, things like Uber, things like, just going around the taxi cab monopoly, right? That's one way to achieve a little bit of liberty and free market education just by the example of success. 3D printing, self-sufficient entrepreneurs, Bitcoin, free market money, and who knows what we're going to have next with AI and with robotics. So I guess I have a little bit of optimism for the future in that respect.
Stephan, for people listening in, right? If say they're busy with their job, they're busy putting food on the table, they're commuting. If we were to like reduce it, simplify it, distill it, would you say it's fair to think about liberty in the sense of how much of my income do I get to keep? Just this relatively speaking, right? How much of my income do I get to keep? What's my surplus at the end of the day? And if it's more, it means my society has more ingredients to perhaps reach liberty sooner than if I was paying all my income towards taxation and I had nothing left at the end of the day to save in Bitcoin or in gold or something that's decentralized.
I mean, I think taxation and your personal wealth is one proxy you can use to measure the quality of your life and the impact of your society and your state on your life. Of course, the problem is most people are working that are surviving on their own. They're working all the time just to survive, right? I mean, nowadays the husband and the wife both have to work and then put their kids in daycare. And I mean, it's like it's a rat race, which I think is to the government's favor, right? To keep people working all the time. They don't have time to learn the trick that's being played on them, right? And it makes them afraid to rock the boat any further. Any change they're afraid of, because if you say you want a world of liberty, then they naturally will ask, well, can you guarantee that in this free world that you're proposing that I will be able to afford private schools for my kids? And unless you can guarantee all this, I'm going to keep what I have, right? Which is the danger, which is why the state adds on to that with the propaganda they give to people in the government schools already. So that is that's one of the challenges we face. I mean, like I said, the state is good at two things: it's good at destruction and good at propaganda. And if you give them the agencies, if you allow them to subsidize the news media and to educate the kids, then that's one huge advantage that they have, and that's one reason it's hard to get people to think outside the box. If you tell someone in Canada or in Europe we should have a free market medical system, they're so used to the government providing health care that they think that's crazy. Even libertarian types are against that. Just like in the U.S., you can't imagine a private interstate system, without the government, because you're just used to that. So it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge.
I mean, what I've noticed is that a lot of people attribute a lot of these failures to capitalism.
right? So then they say, oh, capitalism is so predatory, and like now this cancer drug is $7,000 an application, so clearly the free market has failed. And it's like, well, this has nothing to do with the free market. That market is not free. There's regulatory capture, right? And FDA makes sure that there's only this one, however that happens, whatever. But it's a thoroughly controlled market that doesn't allow for competition. If there were competition, you could get that drug and others, or maybe even better ones, for a fraction of the cost.
Yeah, I mean, Mises has a really good line, which I've always loved, is controls breed controls. And what that means is, the government intervenes, they mess something up, and instead of undoing it and admitting they made a mistake, they fix it with another control. So this gets almost to the problem, like Hoppe's written on this. If we ever achieve liberty, like you could push a button and somehow unwind the state tomorrow, what would you do how would you unwind it? Like, what would you do with all the roads and all the public property and the public forests? And how would you desocialize? Like, how did you desocialize in Eastern Germany after it was reunified with Western Germany? And there's no obvious way to do it. But the problem is, because you have controls on top of controls, you have a layered system. Everything's so integrated and infecting each. If you just push a button and explode it, you're going to have chaos. So people want to have an orderly way of undoing it. And we don't really have the answer to that, because it's not like they're giving us, it's not like they've appointed a commission of libertarians and they said, we're going to let you guys decide how to unwind things. You could sit down and have the top 100 minds in the world figure out the best way to do it. We don't have that power anyway. And even if we did, we might disagree on the best way to do it. I mean, obviously, any way of desocializing would be an improvement, even if it's not perfect. And they would always be imperfect. So, for example, people say, well, you need the patent system because you can't make drugs if you have faced competition, because you have to recoup your costs. So you have to be able to charge a monopoly price with the patent. And my answer will be, well, get rid of the FDA. And then they'll say, well, if you get rid of the FDA, then you have to get rid of this. And you have to get rid of federal income tax withholding. You have to get rid of minimum wage laws. You have to get rid of tariffs. You have to get rid of export control. There's so many layers you have to do. So the reason we have these things is that they have, because of Mises' insight, that controls have led to controls, which you can see this clearly when people say you have to have patents because the FDA is so expensive. So that's not what happened in history. People say this, but that's not what happened historically, because you didn't have an FDA in 1790 when the first Patent Act was. I mean, the first Patent Act was put in place in 90, right after the Constitution was ratified, and there was no such thing as pharmaceuticals in the FDA back then anyway. That came later, and now people use the existence of the FDA to say, well, you need to have patents because there's an FDA. It's like, well, what was your excuse for the patent system in 1790? There was no FDA then. So people lose their memory of what happened, the history of all these things. People are not even aware that the patent system comes from, the word patent means patente, a Latin term meaning open, because of the practice of monarchs granting open letters called open letter patent, which is just a letter written by a king that the holder of the patent grant can show to people, saying the king has given me the exclusive right to do this. Like, I'm the only one who can sell tea or sheepskin from this town, or sell playing cards, or I'm the only one who can make this invention. I mean, like, that's the origin of patents, which led to the statute of monopolies in England in 1623. Patents come from monopoly grants by the king. That's why it was regulated by the statute of monopolies. But now people call it a property right because of propaganda by the entrenched interests. And copyright came because when the printing press emerged in the 1500s, up until that time, the government, the state, and the church together had a monopoly control over what books could be printed. So if you don't want the Protestant Bible printed or the Catholic Bible printed, or you don't want, a satanic book printed, you could just stop it, because the church and the state together controlled the scribes doing the copying. So the printing press threatened to overturn that, the Gutenberg printing press. And so all of a sudden, the state's control and the church's control over thought and speech, which is what they used to control the population, was threatened. And so they put a Band-Aid on it, and they created this thing called the Stationers Guild, Stationers Company, which for about 100 years had a monopoly over what books could be printed. So if you're an author, you had to go to the Stationers Company to print your book. You didn't have, a laser printer in your basement. You could print it yourself. And so they had temporary control, and when that monopoly started expiring in the Statute of Anne was enacted in 1710, which made it seem like they were helping the authors because it gave a copyright to the authors. But back in those days, you still had to go to the publishing houses to publish your books. You couldn't do it yourself. So you had to assign your copyright back to the publishing company. So the publishing industry emerged, and they had the same control over what books could be printed as now. Government regulations like outlawing certain things like obscenity and libel and defamation. It wasn't really a free market. So copyright, the system of copyright we have also came from government control of thought. And everyone thinks of patent and copyright as property rights, but they came from these state practices of controlling information and granting monopolies from the patent system. And people just aren't aware of that. They've gotten so used to the propaganda wars from the 1800s. See, in the 1800s, the free market economists started saying, why the hell is the government issuing these patents to protect people from competition? We should abolish these patents because we're free trade. We believe in free trade and free competition in the free market. And there was actually a growing movement in the mid 1800s to abolish the patent system. Some countries started abolishing it, or some delayed implementing it. And then in 1873, there was this recession. It was called the Great Depression at the time. Now it's called the Long Depression because the other Great Depression has taken that title. But there was this recession, world recession, lasted about 5 or 7 years. And because of that recession, public sentiment turned against free trade. Everyone started doing tariffs and all that to protect their industries because they were suffering from this recession. And so the anti-patent movement in 1870 or so collapsed, and patents started rearing their head. The patent movement gained steam again and became the worldwide system of protecting innovation. But if not for that kind of fluke of history, we might have gotten rid of the patent system or severely curtailed it.
Interesting thing from one of our previous guests, Stephan, we were just talking about China in the times pre it joining the World Trade Organization. And at the time, that's how they represented it. I haven't studied it close enough to really tell the facts, but I'm just retelling them as they said it. At the time, China didn't have strong IP protection, and kind of the attitude was, well, that's because China is not particularly innovative. And once they become more innovative, they would then start enforcing more IP protection. So that I would like your thoughts on that statement, because I think that's a bit weird. But then the other thing is that it seems now there is stronger IP protection in China, but I think it's largely driven by companies in the West otherwise not wanting to do business there. But
Correct.
What do you know and think about that?
Well, so the typical argument you hear by objectivists and libertarians who are in favor of patents is that they think it's a natural part of the free market order. They think it's part of capitalism. And they also make this causation and correlation argument, which is that the reason that the Industrial Revolution happened and that we had such prosperity in the West, in America and in Britain and in Europe in the 1800s, 1900s, was because of the patent system, right? So they actually say that the patent system is one of the reasons for the prosperity in the West and one of the reasons behind the Industrial Revolution. So then they switch to the opposite argument with China by saying that, well, once China becomes prosperous, then they will have patents. I mean, where their other argument is that patents cause prosperity. And then they also, at the same time, accuse China of being a nation that doesn't respect property rights because they don't respect IP. And they criticize them for having 1 billion people come out of poverty in the last 40 years by adopting Western kind of some private property capitalism and by adopting the techniques from the West, by copying basically manufacturing and other scientific techniques from the West. So I don't know if it's like they're sort of talking at both sides of the mouth. Are they happy that China has industrialized and has improved the GDP and has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty? Or do they think they're thieves for copying and emulating what the West has done? Like, do they want them to do it or not? So like they're sort of schizophrenic. And at the same time, you'll hear things like this: China doesn't respect intellectual property. Well, the truth is this: no one in the world respects intellectual property to the draconian degree that the U.S. does. And the reason is because the U.S. Congress is beholden to three special interest groups, which control the whole world, basically: Hollywood, music industry, and the pharmaceutical industry. Those guys are all in favor of strong copyrights and patents. And because everyone in the world is confused about property and they think that property rights come from creation, right? That's kind of the mistake that I think came from Locke's attempt to justify private property rights. Was he mixed in this labor theory that when you mix your labor with something and make it more valuable, you have a property right in it, and therefore you have a natural right in it better than the king's right. And he was right about that, but to come up with this argument, he had to say something about you have a natural right to own your body and to your labor, and if you mix your labor with something. So that led people to this idea that you own your labor, and that's what we call the labor theory of property, which I think is a mistake. You don't need that argument to justify private property rights and things, but that was the sort of assumption, was that if you own yourself, you own your labor, therefore you own things you mix it with. And that idea led to the labor theory of value of Adam Smith and Ricardo, and then Karl Marx and socialism, right? So, which is why the socialists think that if you make a profit as a capitalist or as an employer, if you make any profit at all, you're stealing the surplus labor value of your employees. That's Marxism. But because they believe that people own their labor. So what happens is you have everyone has this mistaken assumption, which makes it easier for the special interests like Hollywood and music and pharmaceuticals to lobby Congress to to not only keep American IP laws increasing in scope and penalties and duration. So, for example, copyright term used to be 14 years. Now it's about 130 years or something on average. It's crazy. And it used to be just a civil crime, but now it's actually a criminal. It's a crime. You can go to prison for copyright infringement. And not only that, they've used the U.S. power since World War II. We've joined the international conventions like the Paris Convention for patents and the Berne Convention for copyright. And we use these organizations like the WTO to push our IP laws onto other countries like China and Europe and other countries, and accuse them of piracy and of copying if they don't join that. So the truth is that China has adopted and does have a working patent and copyright system, just like the U.S. does. Do they enforce it in as draconian a fashion as the U.S. does? Probably not. But even in the U.S., there's no perfect enforcement of patent and copyright law, just like there's no perfect enforcement of the drug war. There's lots of drugs being sold, even though it's illegal. So in China, they have their own patent system. And of course, Chinese companies file for U.S. patents, just like American companies file for patents in China. And when there's infringement, you go to court in the relevant country, in Europe or in Japan or in Canada or in the US or in China, and you file a patent infringement lawsuit and they're enforced, which is not a good thing. It's a bad thing. So China is actually not an IP scofflaw. Now, there is a tradition in China among the people of piracy, which is probably more rampant than in the US, but that's just because they're poorer. There's piracy. I mean, I went to Turkey recently. There's pirated Louis Vuitton bags and Chanel bags everywhere. But that's common even in the U.S. I'm sure you can buy knockoff Rolex watches in the U.S. too. It's just probably a little bit harder to do it, partly because we're richer and people can afford the real thing, and partly because we have a more advanced legal system which enforces not only property rights in real things like houses and cars, but also it enforces taxation more efficiently, which is not good, and it enforces IP law more efficiently than in other countries, which is not good.
So I think you've already made the point and talked around it quite a bit, but could you put it in a nutshell, the case against intellectual property? Or why is it? I mean, from listening to it, sounds like even intellectual property is already a misnomer in a way.
Yeah, it's a misnomer. Well, there are two cases against it. The first case is that it's clearly incompatible with property rights assigned in accordance with homesteading and contract. So the basic rule of private law should be that you can use your body and you can use resources that you own however you like, as long as you don't interfere with someone else's ability to use their resources. In other words, as long as you don't use your body, it's just like the old expression is, your right to control your fist ends where my nose begins, right? So I can use my body however I want. I can make a fist, but I can't swing it and hit your nose with it because that would violate your right to your body. But as long as I'm not polluting on your land or I'm not invading the borders of your land, I'm engaged in peaceful activity within the borders of my own property, like my own factory or my own printing press or my own home. Just like my bedroom, I should be able to do what I want to do in my own bedroom or make whatever food I want to make in my own kitchen. I should be able to print whatever books I want to print in my printing press, and I should be able to make whichever gadgets I want to make in my own factory. Unless I'm committing an act of aggression or trespass against someone else, I'm not committing a rights violation, and I shouldn't be prohibited. And that's what patent rights and copyrights do. Patent rights and copyrights are, their problem is they're called property rights, and so people think of them that way because they were called that in the when the patent proponents and copyright proponents didn't want them to be called monopoly privileges, so they started calling them natural property rights to avoid them being known as what they were, which is government control of information and protection of competition. And so people think of it as a property right. But if you understand that they're not property rights, they're just government grants to someone that allows them to go to the courts and to prevent you from using your property as you see fit, you'll see that they're basically what in the law is called a negative servitude. That's what they really are. Patent and copyrights are negative servitudes granted by the state that allow you to prevent people from using their property as they see fit. If the government gave you a monopoly on performing a certain dance move, and you could use that monopoly to stop people from dancing the waltz. Let's say the government gave you the monopoly on waltzing. So no one can do a waltz unless they get permission from you. And you're going to, of course, charge them a fee for that, a license fee, right? People would understand that that's an unjust law because I'm been given the power by the government of the state to stop you from using your body in a certain way that doesn't harm anyone. But that's what patent and copyright laws do. People don't see that. They don't understand that because they're called property rights. So that's the primary argument against copyright and patent, is that it violates your natural property rights. The second problem is that most people defend patent and copyright now by saying that if you have these laws, it gives people an incentive to generate useful ideas and useful works of art. And without that incentive, we would have less art and we would have less movies and novels and music and less inventions. So they believe that the utilitarian case for patent and copyright is there. And the problem is that it's not. I mean, when these laws were enacted in 1990, there was no econometric studies that says without patent and copyright, we're going to have a suboptimal production of artistic and innovative works. They just assumed that you needed it or that it was justified because of a natural right, which is a flawed argument, as I just explained. In the 200 plus years since modern patent and copyright law, no one has ever been able to do an empirical study or a utilitarian study that shows that this is actually true. Everyone assumes that it's true because they keep hearing this repeated by the vested interest. But there is simply no study that shows this. In 1950, the U.S. Congress, which was considering revising the patent law at the time, hired the economist Fritz Machlup, who is a well-known Austrian economist, to do a systematic study of the U.S. patent system to find out whether we should improve it, whether it really does lead to more innovation and more technology, whether it impedes it. And he did this study, and he looked at everything he could, and he concluded, and this is an official report given to Congress. He says, there's just no way to know whether the patent system really does what it purports to do, which is to lead to more innovation. He goes, we have no way of knowing that. There's no evidence that shows that it does. And that was in 1958. And in the 60, 70 years since then, no one has ever been able to prove it. So there simply is no evidence that the patent system is necessary. So if you got rid of the patent system, you would still have innovation, and there's no reason to believe you would have less innovation. In fact, there's reason to believe you would have more innovation, because under today's system, if you invent something and get a patent on it, you have less of an incentive to keep improving, because you can charge a monopoly price for about 17 years. So it reduces your incentive to keep innovating. And it also reduces the incentive of your competitors to improve on your idea, because if they make an improvement on your original idea, they can't sell that improvement because that would be blocked by your patent. So for a good 17 years, so in other words, as far as we can tell, the patent system reduces the incentive to innovate. And as for artistic works that are covered by copyright, because of their nature as digital and because of the digital age, copyright piracy, as everyone knows, is rampant and widespread. It is impossible to stop it, thank God. So anytime there's a new movie or a new song or a new book, it's instantly available on dozens of sites on the internet for people to pirate if they want to. And yet, no one would argue that in today's world, in which copyright is hardly enforced because of piracy, no one can argue that we have a shortage of new books and new movies and new music. So apparently, the empirical case for copyright is also there's no case for that either. So the nutshell is that patent and copyright violate property rights and liberty, and also lead to restriction of freedoms on the internet, because websites are shut down all the time, and YouTube videos are shut down all the time because of DMCA takedowns, because of copyright infringement notices posted by the copyright holders. So freedom of expression, freedom on the internet, and personal liberty, culture is distorted. And I personally believe, and I think that copyright and patent reduce the quantity and the quality of innovation and artistic works.
I mean, it's interesting that you frame it that way, Stephan, because for example, for Lovis and I, when we're putting this stuff out, or if we write blog posts, we don't think about the fact that somebody's going to copy it and propagate it. And actually, there are a lot of successful newsletter writers that rely on subscriptions, and I don't think they're even really thinking about copyright that much, right? They're happy to say that a large proportion of people that want to get their thoughts or their output will go to the source directly. And I don't think they're leaning too hard on the FBI to go and make sure that nobody's printing it out and sending it off to someone else, right?
I think that, to be fair, I do think that to a degree, the companies that right now rely upon paywalled models, okay, and there are some, right, they rely on that. Some of them, you could say, don't really mind the occasional piracy because they kind of gets their word out. But I do think that a lot of them are relying upon a background of copyright enforcement to reduce the extent of widespread piracy. If you had no copyright at all, you would have people would get these paywalled newsletters, and they would just have websites showing them, because they wouldn't be illegal; it would just be legal. So I do think that for some business models that rely upon paywalls, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way. There's nothing wrong with paywalling your content. It's just that it might be a little bit harder in a free market where there is no copyright and patent to have such a functioning business model that relies upon paywalls, because people could get around it a little bit more easily without copyright. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. By the same token, but for example, right now, if I submit an invention idea to IBM, they will return it to me unopened, because they don't want to be accused of so-called stealing the idea and being by the inventor. Without patent and copyright, they wouldn't be afraid to open it. They wouldn't be afraid to listen. Unless I have an agreement with them, they're free to take that idea and use it and say, take my idea or steal it, some people say, and run with it. So you couldn't rely upon, so what sometimes people do now is they file a patent application first to get a provisional patent application. So they have it on record that they invented it and they have a patent going. And if they approach IBM or some company like that, then they know that the company can't just copy it because the company's afraid they'll get sued for patent infringement later on. If you didn't have a patent system, you'd have to come up with an alternative contractual means to do that. But I think people would find a way to do it. And the fact that it's a little bit harder to fight competition or to profit in the face of competition in a free society without relying upon patent and copyright is just the price of freedom.
I mean, the patenting, all the things they do also costs fortunes, right? So, I mean, I'm reminded a bit of Elon Musk with his release of patents, both in Tesla and in SpaceX, where he doesn't even pursue them in the first place. He's like, well, of course, occasionally we'll file one because we kind of have to, because otherwise there's a lot of gotchas in the system. But clearly you can be pretty successful even if you don't use that strategy, right?
Well, Musk is a good example because, so when he started Tesla, he didn't really officially give a license. He sort of made an announcement, which sends a signal to people that I'm not going to sue you, or if he does sue you, they could defend themselves by saying he effectively gave me a license by making the statement, and he's stopped under legal principles from asserting it. So it's a way of not asserting his patents, but he wanted to do that on purpose because he wanted other people to use his ideas to have competitors to build up the electric car market. So you'd rather be a big fish or a medium-sized fish in a huge pond rather than a big fish in a tiny pond, right? He wanted to be part of a growing market. He didn't want to kill it, which is why patent trolls, by the way, don't want to kill people that they sue. They just want to take a little bit. They want to take a taste. They're like a mafia guy. I just want to taste. I want to wet my beak a little bit. Whereas if a competitor, like if Apple or if Motorola sues a young smartphone company for selling a smartphone, they don't want a cut of this profits. They want to kill them, which is why patent trolls are the least. Everyone complains about patent trolls, but patent trolls are the least offensive form of patents. And people complain about what they call bad patents, like absurd patents or silly patents. Those are the ones that are the least harmful, because if you have a weak patent, then it's hard to enforce because the guy you're suing knows they can probably beat it in court and you're not going to waste your money. So the big problem from patents is not patents by patent trolls and not nuisance suits by patent trolls and not patents that are based upon patent suits based upon silly patents. It's good patents owned by competitors. They will use it and they will win and they will kill you. I mean, that's the problem. The problem is legitimate patents that should have been granted under the patent rules. Yeah. So the other example, by the way, is so Musk now owns Twitter, but before he even owned Twitter, Twitter had a policy of which is interesting. They announced that they would not, I don't know why they did this, because I don't think they were libertarian really motivated. Maybe Dorsey was a little bit libertarian, but they announced this like 10, 15 years ago. They announced that they would not ever aggressively enforce patents. So they were acquiring patents because you need to, for defensive reasons, to acquire these patents, which is why Tesla and SpaceX are doing that as well. If someone comes after you, you need to have a patent war chest to use to countersue someone going after you. So you have to have patents, but you don't have to enforce them aggressively. And Twitter tried to, so they had a policy where they said, we will not aggressively assert our patents against people. But that's just a statement. How can you stop yourself from doing it? So what they did was they put into their employment agreement with their employees, because the employees are the ones that are the inventors of the patents, and they gave the inventor a right. You had to get the inventor's approval to sue. So like if you have some guy that was the inventor on a patent that you're now the owner of because of the inventor had to assign it to Twitter, Twitter would have to get the inventor's permission to sue someone aggressively, and they might not even be working for the company anymore. So it was a way to tie their own hands, which is a sad, it's a big waste of money, right? To have to acquire the patents and then have these agreements to tie your hands so you can't even enforce them later, just to send a signal to the people in the market that I'm not a threat. The whole thing wouldn't even be necessary without patents or copyrights.
Coming up on hour and 15, hour and 20, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. For me, I would love to have a bit of a personal reflection after years after years of your time spent thinking about freedom, coercion, ownership, etc. What does freedom mean to you now? And has that definition changed over time?
Well, the way I think about it is, first, we start off as libertarians with what we call the non-aggression. It was kind of called the non-aggression axiom when I was beginning on this, sort of as a leftover of the Ayn Rand's tendency to call her principles axioms, which I think is a misuse of the term. So nowadays we tend to say non-aggression principle. But the more I thought about it, I realized that non-aggression principle is not fundamentally what we're about. We're for property rights, because you have to identify what property rights people have to know what's aggression. So aggression is a derivative concept, which is a stand-in for our belief in property rights. But the more I thought about that, that's not actually our more fundamental belief either, right? Why do we believe in property rights? We believe in property rights because we oppose conflict being violent interaction between people as opposed to peaceful cooperative interaction. But why do we oppose violent interaction between people? It's because we value our own lives and we value other people's lives. Maybe we don't value other people's lives as much as our own lives, but we do have some empathy. We're social beings and we value living in humanity among our neighbors. I want to have a good life for myself, and I want my neighbors to have a good life too. And a good life means peace and harmony and cooperation and prosperity. And prosperity requires human productivity and effort and ingenuity. And that requires the ability to use scarce resources in the world. So to have a good life, you need wealth. And to have wealth, you need control of resources. And that requires you to have the ability to control these resources without interference with other people, which is why we oppose conflict and property rights. So to me, it's a layered thing. Our fundamental value, I think, as civilized people is well-being of ourselves and of our neighbors. So it's happiness. So happiness and flourishing is the fundamental value that I believe in and that we believe in. The reason I believe in the other things is as means to that end. Happiness for my own sake and in my neighbors, because I'm not a psychopath and I'm a social being and I have empathy for other people. And so do most other people that are not sociopaths and psychopaths and criminals, right? The bulk of people have some empathy for each other. And that's a nice thing. Being part of the human race is nice and good. And living a good life is a good thing. Can you get below that? I don't know. I don't know if you need to. Maybe there are some philosophers who can get beneath that and explain the reason for that. But for me, that's good enough. That's a good enough baseline to start with. Favoring human flourishing and human happiness. Because I believe in that, because I have some understanding of history, the nature of the state, the nature of violence, the nature of human cooperation, the nature of scarcity, the nature of human action, the nature of production and productivity and economics. That's why I believe in property rights as the only way to enable this, to enable a peaceful, productive, happy society. And then, so once you believe in that, then you oppose aggression as the violation of these principles. So the reason I'm a libertarian is because I like myself and other people, and I want good things for people. And the only way to achieve that is to respect their rights in terms of property rights, because we don't live in a world of milk and honey. We don't live in the Garden of Eden. We live in a world where there are limited resources and conflict is possible. And the only way to have happiness is to have prosperity. And the only way to have that is to have property rights respected.
Well, Stephan, thank you so much. For the listeners that want to see what you're up to and follow your work, would you like to let them know where they can keep track of what you're thinking about and what you're writing about?
They can always just go to my website, stephankinsella.com, which has links to my IP special website, which is c4sif.org, but everything is on stephankinsella.com. And the bulk of my thought is in my book, Legal Foundations of a Free Society, which is free online on my site. And you can also purchase a paper copy if you want on Amazon. So yeah, and I tweet on NS Kinsella. I tweet there, and yeah, you can find me there.
Very cool. Thank you so much for taking the time and for breaking this down for us. I feel like I learned a lot.
Good. Happy to do it. Thank you, guys.
And that wraps up our main conversation. But we're not done yet. We're going into overtime, where Jason and I unpack some insights, reflect on what just happened, and connect a few dots. And go.
I actually think that Stephan was incredible how he dissected these topics. He moves fast, like you said, but I don't think that he was too quick to follow. I think he gave plenty of examples that really illustrated quite nicely.
Yep. Very
So
good.
I was actually able to follow his reasoning much better in this format than when we met him in Vancouver over drinks. I definitely slowed down a bit
Don't
there.
drink
So
when you meet Stephan.
yeah.
No, I
I
think
mean,
he was so good because he would draw on something very abstract and then he would bring it down to earth with a real life example time and again, right? So we were
Mhm.
never really left hanging. I was always going to say, oh, can you put it in context? But he always did it himself.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed this state versus government definition. I actually was going to ask, and then he drew it out himself.
Yeah.
I thought that's pretty helpful. It's one of these things, I think, once you see it, once you learn that concept, then it's one of those you can't unsee. And then also, I mean, yeah, he's like, yeah, these definitions like voluntarist versus consensualist, like it's a bit nitpicky, but it matters in the context of having a discussion about this topic. And I can't say that I've ever thought about it in this level of detail for sure, but it does help, right? I think it does add value. And yes, a voluntary action can still be coerced by a threat of force, right? Completely true. Of course, consensualism is really the only way to make sure that an action is actually as intended by the actioner, for example.
I felt at some point that he, it almost felt like a Matrix moment, where they ask Neo, hey, you want the red pill or the blue pill? Like, I think the way he dissected so many things and took away all these fairy tales that we live under or live with or live on, at some point, maybe, a listener might go, oh shit, I wish I didn't have to know all that. Like, I wish, like don't tell me property rights is wrong. How can that be wrong? Right? Don't tell me the state is wrong. How can that be wrong? Like everything that I'm staking my existence on, you're telling me it's aggressive in its fundamental nature. Don't tell me that, right? And the red pill would also say, hey, we don't know if the ending's going to be good. We don't know if there's going to be liberty, right? So that was something that really stood out to me. Sorry. Another thing was how he described when I was asking him about how can we get to liberty, right? And he said something along the lines of, hey, if we were in a post-scarcity world, we might get there sooner because the government becomes obsolete or the state becomes obsolete. And it makes me think about, countries that are not seen as very free, but the people actually live way freer because the basic services that the government does for them is so cheap and so plentiful that they are approaching post-scarcity, right? If you can take a train without thinking about cost. I mean, I get it. I get his point, right? They're doing it under monopoly. But as we've discussed so many times, maybe there's a hybrid. These governments use hybrid models to say, hey, we do have a monopoly, but we can give licenses out, but we give so many licenses that in effect it acts as a market, and we in a way, like, we use our authority and our monopoly and our absolute power to mandate that the market works or that market forces are used.
And at the same time, you're super tough on corruption, right? Both private and public corruption. I think that makes a big difference too.
Yeah, and you're very pro property rights.
Yeah.
Right?
Because I mean, it's so funny, man, how these things work. But I'm listening to Doug Casey's Drug Lord book, right, from the High Ground series. That's the second one, and so I just got the whole whole full breakdown on FDA and how it works according to the authors of the book, right? And it's such a centralized, governmentized racket that it's like the most sophisticated crime syndicate in the world is not nearly as good at squashing competition and all that. And so, of course, they're doing it from a perspective of, oh, we have to protect the public at large, right? That's our function. That's our mandate. And so, and then and nobody can argue with that in a way. So, but then it's like, well, but how do you know that disallowing this drug but allowing this one will actually have the positive impact? It's like, well, we make the rules. We are the arbiters. It's like, well, but that says nothing about the quality of the judgments made, right? Because it's above that. So I thought it was super cool to kind of have these worlds collide, and then for him to call out like, well, the big reason why the U.S. is in this position is because of Hollywood, the music industry, and pharma industry. And I find that all of at least two of these are being disrupted heavily, Hollywood and music. And then pharma, I feel like too, but it's in the US, it's like dug in. But I think globally, I think there is a lot of change afoot, right? So
Yeah.
so like when scientific breakthroughs come from technology like AI, at that point, like, can you really claim IP? You know, there's actually a big open debate. I should have asked Stefan about this.
Next episode.
Yeah. Because if the AI helps you invent something, can I claim IP on it? Not really. But I mean, you could argue either side. But I'm curious. But
I
yeah,
think we're gonna be going through such a massive, swift phase of innovation that trying to keep things under wraps via IP is gonna be very hard, because it's almost as if, right? Imagine you're the US now, and you're now no longer a hegemon, let's say, right? Let's say in some future world. So you've got these different population centers all competing to come up with the next big thing. And if other population centers have, I don't know, let's say 100 different startups, 1,000 trying to get to nuclear fusion, right? And then in the US, there's also 100 or 1,000, but then the government goes and shuts 99% of them down because they don't have the proper patents. Who suffers, right? At the end, that nation that does that society that does that becomes irrelevant or obsolete.
yeah.
So then you end up
For
with
sure.
nothing anyway. And then you have to
Yeah.
pay these other non-patent societies for the right to use their product, because they will be
Yeah.
the ones that know how to operate it, not because they have a patent on it. They'll have the spare parts, they'll have the means to execute, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, when you started talking, I was thinking of the, reindustrialization of the US and, reshoring a lot of manufacturing and stuff. And I think that by necessity, there will have to be a reprise in the enforcement of some IP, because I think when you're, and I think that might also be a key difference why China just does it so differently, or just approaches the topic so differently. Because when you make stuff, you have to be practical. It just doesn't really work any other way, right? And I think since the US has spent a lot of time just in the very what do you call that? Like in more like in the intellectual space. But by that I mean like financial services and software and just generally a service economy. Then it's less tangible, right? And like slapping copyrights on stuff, but then they're maybe not be enforceable anyway. So you can have really draconian measures for the times that you do enforce it and all this stuff. But when you go back and like really want to move the needle in the physical world, making gadgets, or furniture or whatever, all of a sudden I think it becomes much more obvious how this can curb your own wealth in a way.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just relative to other countries. Like maybe they won't respect the foreign patent holder of a US patent as much, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think something like that would almost certainly happen, because it'll be necessary, basically. But yeah, I also thought this point was really cool with the post-scarcity, basically make the functions of the state obsolete, right? Like the government, the state schools, the state healthcare, etc. And I think I think technology right now is actually working towards that, right? So if there's AI tutors that make kids top 1% global performers, then why bother at a very, very low cost, right? Why bother sending your kids to a government school that doesn't do that and costs way, way more, you know? And like similarly with healthcare, right? Like if you have mechanisms to have people be healthy, then you don't really need all this apparatus of industrialized healthcare. Of course, it's not that simple. It's not that simple to achieve, but I think it's also actually less hard than people think.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I definitely think that that's a good way to think about liberty, is by not go into conflict with it and like try to break the system, burn it down, but just work on creating alternatives that are so good that they become no-brainers and therefore make people less reliant on the state product, so to speak.
Yeah. There's one line from the Tao Te Ching written by Lao Tzu, and he says, "The best rulers are those whom people barely even know exist.
Mm.
The next best are those that are loved and praised. The next best are those that are feared. The worst are those that are despised. When the best leader's work is done, the people actually say, 'We did it ourselves.'"
Nice.
How cool is that, right? And then there's another one which I think a Roman leader also, I think, is it? Oh man, I'm so bad with European history, but I think it was Cicero that said it. But he said something like, "You want to see how corrupt a state is, see how many rules they have." And here in the Tao Te Ching, chapter 57, Lao Tzu says, "The more prohibitions and rules, the poorer people become. The more laws are promulgated, the more thieves and robbers there are."
Yeah, because you're giving each of them a foothold.
Yeah, and they use that to their advantage because they then know how to manipulate, right? You are opening the door to manipulators and...
Both public and...
Yeah, exactly. So, I don't know. I think a lot of these things have been thought of before already as well. So going into... Don't think liberty is such a new idea, but I guess we always feel like we must be closer to it just because so much time has passed. Which I guess is correct, but it doesn't mean that it's imminent.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think in many ways there is more liberty in the world. There's an increasing trend of it. But I think because of that, also then centralized entities ratchet up the pressure against it because they kind of see it, like they kind of feel the sand slipping through their fingers, kind of a thing. But I think that's also then actually adds on to their faster collapse in a way, or not even collapse, but like obsolescence, right?
Yeah, they have to. I think states around the world will just realize, hey, the only way to be competitive is if we treat our people well. And in this case, treating our people well means giving them more liberty, right? So it will be a survival of the fittest per se, but in this case, fittest would be most free.
Yeah, man. I thought this was an incredibly cool discussion with Stephan. Really enjoyed it. Maybe like for me, this felt like a pretty intellectual conversation, but it was not devoid of being practical at the same time. So I think that was really, really cool.
Yep, agree.
And I think I'll send him send him a follow-up email on the question, like, what if AI is involved in the invention process? Like, how does that,
Maybe
what
you
impact
can
does that have on the IP?
Yeah, maybe include in the email that you send out to subscribers.
Yeah.
So anybody listening that's not yet a subscriber, jump on our Substack and subscribe so you get everything via email, not just the video.
There you go.
Alrighty, mate.